Hi everyone, my name is Heather Elin and I am a professional astrologer, and today I'm here to talk to you about one of my favorite topics in astrology, which is medical astrology. But before we get into that, I just wanted to give you guys a little bit about who I am and why I'm even here talking to you about this. So I first started getting interested in astrology many years ago when I was in graduate school for clinical psychology. I was going through a period in my life where things were really difficult and I felt like I was on the completely wrong path and I did not know what to do about it. A lot of things in my life were going awry at that time. And I happened to have a friend that was really interested in astrology and all of these sort of like new agey woo-woo things that at that time I sort of just rolled my eyes at. I didn't pay much attention to what she had to say. And so I just kind of ignored it. But one day, after a really difficult couple of weeks, I went to her house and paid her a visit. And without me even saying anything, she started telling me about these astrological alignments, these planetary alignments in the sky, and how they were impacting me in that moment. And it was so spot on that I was instantly hooked. I needed to know how she did that. And so she recommended a book. I took it home with me. And I started to pick apart my birth chart, my personal astrology. And I started to look at how all of these different planetary alignments that were present at the time of my birth corresponded to who I was and my personality. And it was so accurate to the point where it was a little bit freaky. This book that it's a book, right? It's not sentient. It somehow knew me better than I even knew myself. It was describing me better than I could describe myself. And so from there, I was instantly obsessed with astrology. I was instantly hooked, and I've been studying it ever since. Around that same time, I actually was suffering from chronic illness. I started to become very sick and have a lot of really strange symptoms. And so the doctors that I was seeing, the allopathic doctors, weren't very helpful. They would either tell me things that ended up making things worse. They would not know what to do with me and just sort of push me off to somebody else, or they would tell me things that would literally just scare me, and that wasn't helpful either. And so I was already open to alternatives and sort of searching for the right thing that could help me piece together what was going on with my body. And so since I started studying astrology at that time, pretty much a few months after that, I learned medical astrology was even a thing. And I started to study that as well. And so that's been an interest of mine for a very long time. And so before we get into medical astrology, we have to kind of first preface this with what astrology even is, because I know for a lot of you this is going to be somewhat new information. And so astrology essentially is the study of how planetary and celestial alignments correspond to matters pertaining to humanity here on Earth. So how the planets and the stars and the tropical zodiac, how all of these different placements and alignments impact or at least correspond to things that are going on here on Earth that impact us as individuals. The practice of astrology dates back a minimum of 4,000 years. That's when we have the first recorded evidence that astrology was even a thing. And it probably dates back prior to that period as well. Across all cultures and civilizations throughout history, there are different forms of astrology. Pretty much every culture across the world had their own way of looking at these celestial omens and corresponding what was going on in the skies and in the heavens to events here on Earth. And the first type of astrology, which was originated in ancient Mesopotamia and Egypt around that same period, 4,000 years ago, was actually what we refer to nowadays as mundane astrology, which is looking at how the planetary alignments and the celestial events impact major world events, societies, cultures, important prominent figures like kings and emperors, and now we look at like presidents and governments and things like that. And so that's how it really got started. They started to notice that things like eclipses would correspond to maybe the death of a king or something along those lines. And so astrology originally was actually state-supported and state-funded. The only people who had access to astrology were people in positions of power because it was more pertinent to them and they could utilize it strategically. If they knew that they were more likely to go into battle at this time and lose, they wouldn't do it. If they knew that this time was more auspicious based on the planetary alignments for their country to win the battle, then they would do it then. It could warn them about things like potential for, their death or some sort of like crazy political event that was going to occur, an uprising. And so they could get ahead of it, right? And they could control the masses a lot more easily. Eventually, this trickled down and they started to develop more complex forms of astrology. And these forms of astrology were more focused on individuals and how these celestial alignments impacted just individual people and our normal day-to-day lives. And so that's what we primarily practice today, is looking at individual people's charts, different things like personality traits and events and life circumstances, and how these things are all connected through the lens of the planetary alignments at the time of birth. And so astrology became the most popular. It reached its height of popularity and its height of being the most technically advanced, actually, even more so than today, in Hellenistic Greece and at the height of the Roman Empire. And so at that time, astrology was really widely accepted. It was considered to be akin to science. All the astrologers were also astronomers. A lot of these people were really prominent thinkers in other fields, really great philosophers, things like that. And so it was really widely accepted and highly regarded at that time. And so it was a big thing. But then we had the sort of decline of the Roman Empire and the rise of Catholicism. And so when the Roman Catholic Church came to power under the Emperor Constantine, who legalized Catholicism, that was actually when astrology was officially banned by the state, by the government. And so astrology was banned, and the astrologers, who had very extensive libraries with like thousands and thousands of books, all of this information, were forced to burn their libraries. And so we lost a lot of really incredible information that we are still working to piece together today. We have bits and pieces and things that we can translate and put together, but a lot of that has been completely lost, and so we're still working to recover it. And so this really advanced form of astrology that was very specific, very detailed, very technical, we're not even at that level now. And so what happened at that time was the astrologers that continued to practice astrology, they were actually either exiled and forced to leave, or they were publicly tortured. And so they made an example of them, right? And it was actually documented historically that some of the higher-ups in the Catholic Church, the reason that they wanted to ban astrology was because they believed that it posed a threat to Christianity, because it was sort of a different ideology that showed you that you could understand things without their help. You didn't have to pay the church or go through the church to get salvation. A lot of things seemed like they were predetermined, or that you could sort of figure out that things were going to happen. And so back in Hellenistic Greece, by the way, astrology was way more fatalistic, and nowadays it's more about fate and how you work with that with free will, so it's a little bit more open like that. But back then it was seen as like very deterministic, and so if all these things are fated, then why pay this clergy, for your salvation? What's going to happen is already going to happen in their mindset, right? So they were very opposed to this. And so that's what happened then. It was demonized, and people were, tortured and all of that. And so to this day, astrology is, mocked. People think it's just, sun sign horoscopes and things like that. So when people think about astrology, they usually think about this. So this would be like a general sun sign horoscope that you would see in the newspaper. It's just a little blurb, it's super vague, and it's only looking at one component of a very vast array of information that you can determine by looking at your individual specific chart. And so it has to be broad, it has to be general. And so the reason that people are interested in sun sign horoscopes, and the reason why this is even popular, is because everyone knows their sun sign. You don't need to know your birth time, you don't have to look at this really complicated math. You just know that between these time periods, you're a Virgo or you're a Taurus. And so you can look at this horoscope. Sometimes it's a little accurate. Sometimes it seems kind of vague and it could apply to everyone. Sometimes it's not accurate because it's not accounting for the whole picture. And so this, serves a purpose in that it gets people interested in looking into astrology, but it also kind of serves to discredit it, right? Because it's like vague and kind of sometimes a little nonsensical. And so this is what people usually think about when they are thinking about astrology. But when I think about astrology, I think about this. So this would be a typical birth chart that I would be looking at if I was doing a reading for somebody. And so you can see here that there are all sorts of things going on. These little symbols in the center here, these are all of the planets and also different astronomical calculations that we utilize for interpretations in astrology. The right side of the chart would be the eastern horizon, so that's the tropical zodiac sign that was rising on the eastern horizon from that exact moment, placement, and perspective of your birth. And so that little X in the center that the cursor's on, that would be you. And then on the western horizon, that would be the left side of the chart. It shows the planets and the zodiac sign rising on the western horizon. And so what I'm looking at here is where all of the planets were in respect to you, in respect to the horizon, within the tropical zodiac, and in alignment with one another. So all of these planets are also interacting with one another. And so each piece of this puzzle gives me a different layer of information, and it becomes pretty complex, and you can look at a lot of different things when you're looking at something like this. And so it's very different than the sun sign horoscope. And so what is medical astrology? So medical astrology is essentially the study of how planetary and celestial alignments correspond to illness in the body. And so in modern Western medical astrology, it's not typically used for diagnosis. That's not what we do. What we do with medical astrology is somebody will come to us who already has some sort of physical illness, and we can look at what patterns would correspond to that illness and how those patterns correspond to things like psychological traits, past trauma, maybe some abuse, maybe certain life circumstances that were difficult. We can look at how this also aligns with different patterns or habits that this person has, or different tendencies. And so you can get a more holistic viewpoint of how everything is all connected to this physical illness. So it kind of gives you just a roadmap of all the different things that may be correlated or contributing to the illness beyond just the physiological. Medical astrology can also be utilized to help you work with your natural tendencies in order to create better health. And so you can see things like if a person is more prone to having a sweet tooth, right? And they need to have that satiated. You can see if that person is easily able to stick to a regimented, really disciplined health routine. Say if they have their 6th house, which rules health, occupied by Capricorn, which is discipline and structure. Or if their 6th house is occupied by a sign that needs more freedom and more excitement in their diet and in their health routines. They're not going to be able to stick to a rigid, structured plan very easily. And so if they try to do that, they're going to set themselves up for failure. People might kind of already intuitively know that, but they'll try to put themselves in these boxes that it's like a one-size-fits-all plan. And a lot of times it doesn't really go with what they are just naturally prone to doing and what they naturally need in order to stick with that plan. So that's something we can look at as well. Another way medical astrology is utilized is to determine, well, also you can determine different areas of weakness in the body and how that corresponds to different psychological patterns and things like that. So you can work on that, support the different systems in your body that might be a little bit weaker or that might turn into something that could be problematic later on, so you can kind of get ahead of that. And it's also utilized to determine the best times to seek out help for the illnesses that you have. And so, if you go to see a doctor at a time that's not considered to be auspicious, you might not get the results you desire. You might not get the answers you're looking for. And so if you're somebody who's struggling with that, who maybe has some sort of mysterious chronic illness or autoimmune condition, you can actually use the best timing to find the answers that you're actually looking for in the first place. This is also sometimes used to do things like scheduling elective surgeries to make sure the outcome is going to be more positive, things of that nature. And so these are the various ways in which medical astrology is used today. And you can see here this little map. So in medical astrology, the different zodiac signs are associated with different body parts and organs in the body, and the planets are actually associated with the functions of the body and the different organ systems. So those are more like the actions that are occurring. And so if you look at this map here, Aries, the sign of Aries rules the head and the upper jaw. You have Taurus, which rules the lower jaw and the throat. You have Gemini, which rules the arms, the fingers, the upper extremities, and also the lungs. And it also rules a majority of the nervous system. You have Cancer, which rules the stomach, it rules the breast, it rules the ovaries and reproductive system in females. It also has an association with the limbic system in the brain. You have Leo, which rules the heart, the circulatory system, It also rules the thymus gland. You have Virgo, which rules the intestines, and it also rules the intrinsic or enteric nervous system, so the nervous system, your gut brain. You have Scorpio, which rules the genitals. And so Scorpio, if some of you are aware, is a sign that's associated with like heightened sexuality and passion. And so it makes sense on a medical level that it would rule the sex organs. Sagittarius rules the thighs. I skipped over Libra. Libra rules the kidneys and it rules the hips. And it also has to do with endocrine function and balance in the endocrine system. Sagittarius rules the thighs and the liver. Capricorn is the knees, but it's also all of the bones. So Capricorn is a sign that creates structure and form. So it's all the containers of the body. And it's all the parts of the body that are hard and solid and create that structure. So it's the bones in general, it's the spine and the back, and it's the teeth, it's the hair, it's the nails. So Capricorn has all of those rulerships. Aquarius are the calves and the ankles, but also the body's innate electrical circuitry. And then Pisces is kind of pretty basic. It's the feet. And so a lot of times if you have a lot of Pisces energy, you may have sensitive feet. And so I'm just going to give you guys a little bit of an example of some of the things that I see in terms of patterns in astrology and how they correlate to different things beyond just the physiological illness. And so I'm going to focus on two areas that I have a lot of experience with personally and that I've looked at and worked with a lot astrologically, because these are two things that are sort of epidemic in our society today. So the first one would be anxiety. It's estimated that about a third of all of the entire population actually has or has had a diagnosable anxiety disorder at some point in their life. And so anxiety is very, very prevalent in our society, and it's very prevalent when I look at these patterns in astrology because a lot of these things are very common. So in anxiety, one of the things that you'll see oftentimes is Mercury, which is the planet that rules the mind, the nervous system, and your intellectual capacity. You'll see Mercury in a close conjunction with the sun. When Mercury is with the sun, it's considered to be heightened in its energy, but also heightened in a way that can be very challenging. And so you have Mercury in this close conjunction with the sun. Mercury is your thoughts. And so it strengthens your mind and strengthens your thoughts. So people who have this are typically highly intelligent. They have very strong minds, but their minds can be hyperactive and overactive. So these are people who will be playing and replaying conversations over and over in their head. They're going to be overthinking everything. They're going to have a hard time shutting their brain off. They're prone to rumination. They're prone to just having a lot going on in their head. And so that can cause them to become mentally exhausted, physically exhausted, and also can make them more prone to anxiety and just being overall a little bit more nervous. And so these people, because Mercury rules the breath and the lungs, right? So one of the things that they can do in general is good to do for anxiety is really intense breath work, right? Focusing on their breathing. Another thing too, Mercury is communication and writing. And so these people do really well with journaling and writing down their thoughts. They need to get it out of their head so they don't have to keep thinking about it over and over again. And oftentimes they're actually really great writers too, because that mercurial energy is so strong. The sun is your soul's expression of purpose and physical reality. It's what you came here to do. It's what you need to feel successful and satisfied with your life. And so if you have that mercurial energy with your sun, you need to communicate. That's part of what you're here to do. That's part of what your soul wants you to do. And so communicating what you're thinking, writing about it, doing those breath exercises. Mercury, as I mentioned before, or Gemini, which is ruled by Mercury, has an association with the use of your hands and your upper extremities. So working with your hands, maybe doing something creative or having some sort of hobby where you're doing something like making things or something like that. That can be a really good way to shut down the mind and to use this in a way. So the idea is to use this up in a positive way. So it's not expressing itself in a negative way, which would be like overthinking and being anxious. There are a few other things here, like Mars aspecting the sun or Uranus. Mars is your energy. It's your willpower. It's your ability to take action. It's how you act on your own volition. But it's also just a very highly energetic, very like high energy planet. And then when you have Uranus there, Uranus is disruption. It's kind of a chaotic energy. And so these people are typically very impulsive in the actions that they take. They're kind of doing things and starting things all over the place. They have a difficult time sticking to one thing at a time or following through with whatever it is that they're doing. And they also tend to be more nervous, more excitable, and they have a lot of like high-strung energy, and so that's one of the things. And also heavy emphasis on Cancer or Virgo in the zodiac signs. So if you have a lot of planets in Cancer or Virgo, that tends to be correlated with, anxiety and things like that. And then Neptune. This is one that's kind of interesting because Neptune in the 12th house makes people very, very sensitive to like etheric energies, things in their environment. They're typically very psychic and very attuned to what's going on beyond this realm and beyond our typical level of awareness, to the point where it's impacting them all the time. And so they have a difficult time figuring out where all of these different sensations or ideas or emotions are coming from. And they oftentimes do pick up on things that can be a little bit scary to them, especially in childhood. And they're usually conditioned to fear these abilities that they have because their parents are like freaked out by it. Like, Mom, I saw a ghost. And, the mom gets terrified, like, you saw a ghost, oh crap. And so the kid becomes terrified of their abilities. And so they actually, every time they experience these sensations, these intuitive hits, or these, otherworldly connections even, they become afraid. And that actually creates this conditioning where, they're a little bit more anxious because they're always picking up on this stuff and they're automatically fearful of it. And so that's part of, there are so many different patterns that could contribute to anxiety, but these are just some of the most common ones. And then chronic illness. So this is one that I find most interesting, mostly because it affects me, but also it affects a lot of people. Chronic illness is an epidemic today. And so this is something that's really important to start to piece together and understand because a lot of people are looking for answers. And so before I even get into the technical stuff, one of the things that I see predominantly with people who have any form of chronic illness, especially like chronic fatigue, fibromyalgia, autoimmune conditions, things like that, is that there are usually patterns in their astrology and actual real life experiences that correlate to that of having some sort of childhood trauma or abuse, or living in a situation where they're always on edge and always trying to figure out what's going to happen next. What's the adult in my life going to do? How am I going to navigate this? So they're already primed in their nervous system and in their brain to be more hyperreactive to things. Or sometimes they're physically abused or psychologically abused. There's a lot of anger in the household, and they feel like they don't have the ability to stand up for themselves. And that actually tends to correspond to having a weakened immune system or immune system dysfunction. Because when you have Mars, which Mars rules your actual, like, wanting to defend yourself, right? Mars is anger, it's aggression, it's the god of war, and it also represents your defenses and your temper. And so when you have that energy debilitated, you're not going to want to stand up for yourself. So that usually indicates displaced anger in childhood. It indicates an inability to stand up for yourself in adulthood because you felt like you could never have a win. And that also tends to correlate to having a weakened or dysfunctioning immune system. And so I see that a lot in the astrology as well. But so you'll usually see these patterns of childhood trauma, and then later on you'll see these patterns of chronic illness. And those patterns in the chart are essentially the same. A couple of other things that are kind of interesting though, so afflictions to the moon, especially by Neptune or by Saturn, oftentimes correspond to things like food sensitivities. Afflictions to the asteroid Ceres are also associated with food sensitivities, but specifically to gluten and dairy, which is something that a lot of people have. And then Saturn in conjunction. So a lot of things that I see in these patterns also correspond to boundary issues. So people who have difficulty asserting their own personal boundaries with other people tend to have issues with chronic illness and especially chronic fatigue. And so one of the indicators for that is Saturn in what's called an in conjunction, which is a 150-degree aspect. When Saturn's in an in conjunction, usually people, they don't have good boundaries. This is because in early childhood, They're usually, they usually grow up under circumstances where their parents felt like they struggled or they sacrificed a lot to take care of their children. Their children were kind of a burden or a huge responsibility, and they make sure their children know that. They are very vocal about, I sacrifice this, that, and the other thing, and I work really hard to put food on the table. So the child ends up internalizing that. They feel like a burden. So as they get older, the way that they often alleviate this is by carrying the burdens of other people. If I'm doing all this stuff for you, if I'm responsible for you, how can I be a burden? I'm not a burden, I'm helping, right? And so they get into this pattern where they're taking on so much stuff for other people that it becomes overwhelming, and sometimes their own responsibilities get neglected. This is a pattern that's also associated very specifically with chronic fatigue. And the theory that I have is that their bodies are just saying enough is enough. Now you can't do anything anymore. You can't help these people. And so that's one of the, I see a lot of patterns that have to do with boundary issues, but that's kind of the biggest one. And so it's usually a combination of things. Childhood trauma, being primed on that like brain and nervous system level for being hyperreactive or underreactive to external stimuli, and also, illnesses in the body and things like that. And then this lack of boundaries, or this like becoming overly obligated, wanting to help everyone. Like these are people that always want to help other people, which is not necessarily a bad thing if you're not neglecting yourself in the process, right? And so that's the lesson with a lot of the people who I see who come in, who show up with these chronic illness patterns. And so those are just my examples, and that's pretty much all I have for you guys today. Do you guys have any questions? Yeah.
Just a general astrology question. I've been dabbling for, I don't know, probably about 15 years now, looking at my charts, doing charts with friends and things like that. And the question that I get the most often from skeptics is, well, how come Pluto is not a planet anymore? Does that affect anything? And I just wondered how you respond to those kinds of skeptical questions.
Okay, yeah, so she was asking how I respond to skeptical questions, especially things like, well, Pluto's not a planet anymore, why are you looking at Pluto? Well, in astrology, everything's a planet. So the sun's a planet, the moon's a planet, Pluto's a planet. So that's just how it's always been done and always been looked at. Everything is sort of equal on that level. The sun and moon do have different qualities that are not necessarily the exact same as the planets. They're also considered luminaries. But when you look at Pluto being demoted from a planet to, what is it now, like a dwarf planet or something like that, yeah, I mean, it's not really relevant to astrology. It still means the exact same thing. I don't actually have anyone who has asked me that. What people often ask me, though, is like, okay, so how does this work, right? How could the planets be impacting what I'm doing here on Earth? The way that I always respond to that is that think about the sun and the moon, right? The sun and the moon have a very obvious effect on human behavior, plant life, animal life. They're impacting us in a very direct, observable way. They're very close to the Earth, and in astrology, these are two of the most important influences, the strongest influences in your chart, because they are so close to the Earth and they impact us more heavily. And so if the sun and the moon can impact all life on Earth, and even in their behaviors in some animal species, why can't Mercury impact us on a more subtle level? Why can't Venus, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, or even Pluto, all the way out there on a very subtle, small level, be impacting our experience here on Earth? And so it's just something to think about there. And I think am I out of time? Yeah, 1 minute. If anyone has another question? No? All right. Oh, yeah.
Do you work with astrocartography at all?
Astrocartography? Yeah, that's actually something that I really specialize in. So that's, she's asking if I can look at how astrology impacts you, your own personal astrology impacts your experience in different locations around the world. And that's a whole other field. There's so many fields of astrology. But yes, I do. All right. Well, thank you guys so much. This was fun.